Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Wireless Today in Education webinar. Today we have Melanie Honeycutt, the CIO of Burke County Public Schools, Bruce Miller, the VP of Enterprise Marketing at Cambium Networks, and in a little bit we'll have Jonathan Kidwell, Senior Director of Education Sales at Cambium Networks, joining us today. But before I start, I also want to mention that we'll have a Q&A session at the end of today's webinar, so feel free to ask any questions in the Questions tab on the control panel. On that same control panel, you'll find and be able to download all of the handouts from today's webinar in that Handouts tab. But without further ado, I will hand it off over to you, Bruce.
Great, thank you, Riley, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We have a worldwide audience here. We want to talk a bit about wireless in education today and some of the challenges and the scope of the current environment and some of the solutions that we offer as a vendor related to that. Pleasure to have Dr. Honeycutt here on the line with us today to talk through some of the things that they've been going through there at Burke County. And as Riley mentioned, please make this interactive. If you have any questions, please pop them into the Questions tab, and we'll get to those questions as we go through the presentation today. Just a bit on the agenda. Do a quick introduction, and then I'll hand it over to Melanie. We'll talk about some of the new needs in wireless today and how wireless fabric solutions can really create an environment across your entire campus to support all of your internet connectivity needs today and tomorrow. And then specifically talk about some use cases related to how you're deploying wireless in education today. So if we take kind of a high-level look at some of the challenges that we've gone through, in the educational sector over the last year, I talked to a lot of different customers, and you see, quite a bit of dynamics worldwide, and it's not the same everywhere. We have some areas where schools are in session and things are relatively normal. We have other areas that are completely locked down still, and no kids are in the class, and everything is being done remote. And then we have everything in between. Obviously, we're hoping that as we move forward, things will get back to normal for the fall year. But I think there's a lot of adjustments that our customers have gone through, and there's 770 million students worldwide when we look at the overall educational system. So it's a huge impact when you look at what has occurred with the impact of COVID within the last year and a half. And many of those, it comes down to the fact that you need access to the network. The numbers vary. 40 to 50% of students around the world do not have access. If you look at specifically in the U.S., it's about 18% is the numbers we've seen. So there's been some creative ways of providing access to home internet or internet in the home or in other areas where they can get access to. So that's one of the problems we'll talk a little bit about today here as well. And then one of the things that we do as Cambium is we work heavily with a lot of internet service providers, the wireless service providers, and there's definitely been an evidence of a lot of shifting traffic and different needs when it comes to the network itself. That 35% number is a global number in terms of the increase in internet bandwidth over the last year. Every year it goes up, but prior years the number was quite a bit smaller than that, perhaps 20% or so. So there's definitely been an increase overall in bandwidth. Lots of video, obviously, that people are using to collaborate and have remote sessions. And so this traffic has created different patterns, congestion points that didn't exist before, new types of traffic that people have to make sure that they're able to support on their networks. And so these dynamics are the things that we see as very much evident in the nature of schools today. And we'll talk a bit about how the networks that need to adapt to those changes can support this kind of dynamic that we're seeing. Some key focal points for education, just in our discussions with customers and kind of what we see overall. There's obviously a lot of flexibility that's needed in today's world. Back in March of 2020, lots of our customers were scrambling to do things to get back online in a remote distance learning kinds of scenarios. In some cases, they expanded coverage to outdoor locations, and the underpinning requirement in all these cases was having, a reliable, fundamentally stable network to be able to support these things. And in many cases, they found that they didn't have that, right? So adjustments were needed to be made in many cases. The bottom line with any educational institution is success of the for the student and the mission, the goal of learning. So some of those kinds of new techniques that have been evident over the past number of years have gone into acceleration mode to support remote learning, online testing, cloud-based systems, moving a lot of systems into the cloud to support those remote environments, LMSs and other types of systems that are being used. So we've seen that kind of shift, not only in the solutions that schools are using from a learning perspective, but also in the tools that IT uses as well to support that. And that's one of the things that can be key, is the flexibility to support cloud-based systems that are on 24/7 and support a remote and distributed environment. And then safety considerations as well. We talked to a number of schools that are deploying some new infrastructure, video, and these kinds of things related to that. And these all then integrate more and more together into the same framework and network. You need a common infrastructure to support your learning activities, as well as some of the infrastructure requirements that you have within your facilities and security systems as well. And I know a lot of customers that we talk to, are doing more and more of that kind of integration over time. And that's an increased consideration for us in terms of how we design our systems to support that. IoT becoming very, very prevalent, sensors and other kinds of devices that you may need to be connecting to the same network and accommodate. And their requirements are very, very different and diverse from perhaps the students or the teachers' requirements that they have. So these are some of the things that we're seeing and focal points that we have put in place relative to the solutions that we produce to support this. And wanted to highlight a few of those things ahead of handing it over to Dr. Honeycutt to talk through a bit about how Burke County Public Schools is dealing with some of these things and working through some of the changes that have occurred over the last year plus. So I want to hand it over, Melanie, to you for this next section.
Thank you, Bruce. I want to share too that I have about 27 years in education, and during that whole time, it's been basically involved with technology, either inside a school environment, working for the State Department, or back with my own county right now. So just a little background on our county in general. Our current population is about 90,000. We have about 18% of our population that's under the age of 18. We have 81% of our households have some type of computer, but I want you to look, households with broadband is only 71%, almost 72, but we still have a lot that do not have any broadband access. We have an average household income of about $44,000. We're 507 square miles. We're listed as part of the Hickory metro area in North Carolina, but we're mostly rural in our area. We are in the foothills of the North Carolina mountains of the Blue Ridge. So we have a lot of areas that are very sparsely populated with large farms, and we have a lot of breweries here as well that have large areas of land. Our top 3 employers, we're the second largest county in North Carolina that employs state of North Carolina employees. We have several state agencies here in addition to the school system. We are also the Western End for the North Carolina School of Science and Math and several other pieces. Healthcare is another big issue for us, and manufacturing is big. Used to be furniture, now it's very technical, and it's building for cars and different chips for automobiles, and I mean, we do a lot of specialized manufacturing now. So our county has changed over the past 10 or 15 years. And in that process, so has our student body. So right now, our student body is at about almost 12,000 students. We are 65% white. We are 18% Hispanic. 18%, and out of that 18%, roughly 8% do not speak English when they first come to our schools. So that's a piece that we have to work with as well. Then we have 4.4% that are African American. Our student body has changed dramatically over the past 10 to 15 years. So moving to the next, how do we get to this? We're now 1-to-1 Chromebooks 2 through 12 and 1-to-1 iPads K1. We didn't start that way. You never start that way, right? The pandemic pushed us to make sure that we had devices in the hands of every student to go home. So a whole new set had to be changed for us. We had to find funding for the devices. We had to get the devices into the hands of students. We had to offer ways for students to be able to access at home, especially in areas that would not have access. And most importantly, we had to make sure that our school was ready. So before we did all of this, luckily, 3 years prior to this, I started planning. We had infrastructure where we had arrays just in certain areas. We still had some believe it or not, some Cat 4 around in our school. We had teachers that were using outdated smart boards or old TVs. So my superintendent came to me and said, I want to be 1-to-1 in 5 years. Well, the pandemic made it 1-to-1 in 3 years, right? But he said, I want to be 1-to-1 in 5 years, but I feel like our students are not able to connect inside the classroom. Well, here's the reason why. We had a poor infrastructure. You have to start with that infrastructure, and you have to make sure that you have those pieces in place before you can ever get to this. So we started with rewiring all of our schools. We capitalized as a school system. We're able to capitalize on E-rate. We capitalized on E-rate. They rewired all of our schools. We put in gig switches at all of our schools. Most importantly, we put an array in every classroom. So as I looked around to decide what kind of company we were going with, we really evaluated and looked at everything that Cambium and at the time Xeris and all of those had to offer. And we have now have an array in every classroom, and we're getting ready to upgrade our network one more time to 10 gig switches in all of our schools, because you are only as good as your connection. Every device you have is great, but if you can't connect to the internet, especially with Chromebooks, then you're dead in the water. So we started with infrastructure. We started with that basic piece, and we moved from there. So with connections and communications, we talked about how high-speed internet was going to be challenging for our staff and for our students. We had staff members that didn't even have high-speed internet at home. We started looking at hotspots, but they're challenging because cell phone coverage here is very spotty. We looked at filtering and making sure that social emotional learning was available, not just for our students, but for our staff. We tried to offer alternative ways for people to connect. We put arrays on the outside of all of our buildings. We put them down at press boxes on our football fields so that students could drive in anywhere in their school and connect. We did hotspots with community. We got the community involved, and we said, if you have wireless available, we want to be able to have our students know where it's at. We went into churches and helped churches rewire and give them support and set it up to where our students could learn inside there and utilize that as well. We involved that community as much as we could. We put an AP in every classroom. I've got this in capital letters. You can never have enough arrays in a school. You need one in every classroom. We made sure that our switches and our internet connection and all of our wiring was up to date and doing the latest. Like I said, we're getting ready to update to 10 gig switches in all of our schools. We have 10 gig at our main office that goes out. We have 250 gig burstable out to the internet. All those pieces are required. We have one more school, and we will be Cat 6A in all of our schools for wiring. Funding wise, like I said, we capitalized on E-rate. And I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes too, but you have got to become best friends with your CFO, with your chief financial officer. I don't care if you're in a private industry, if you're in a private school, if you're in a charter school, if you're in a school system, your CFO is your best friend. You talk about ways that you can help them save money. You talk about ways that why, and you give them information on how you can make things better. You talk and you keep them fully informed, because if you don't, then you're losing a connection with probably the person that is just as important to you as the superintendent is. You have to have a superintendent that supports this, but you have to have a CFO that supports it too. And you have to have curriculum. People have to be at the table and they have to know what you're doing. High-speed internet, hotspots, all of those pieces have to go with the staff, has to understand that too. So when we first rolled out hotspots, my superintendent said, we're not doing them for teachers. I had 45 teachers out of 900 that had no internet connection at home. I had to call him and say, look, we have to do this. So we had to change our philosophy on it and give these to teachers. Now, we had some teachers that had high-speed internet that wanted it just so they wouldn't have to pay for their own, and we had to explain how that works. So those are some of the pieces that definitely are challenging for us. So what does our wireless infrastructure kind of look like? Our infrastructure right now, can you go to the next slide, Bruce? There you go.
Should be up there. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. We upgraded from aging network that was 7 to 8 years old. We had to have reliable wireless. We went with Apple TVs and touch screens and different things like that throughout our whole district. So we had to have some reliable wireless that would work with that. And then we have upgraded. So we've upgraded 900 APs and we're going to be upgrading 600 more. And then we will be totally upgraded for this year. Now, I can't sit on my laurels. This is an upgrade for a year or two, maybe 3, but you got to keep upgrading. You've got to have the latest that is available so that you can meet all the needs of your teachers. We love the cloud management piece that we have. We like to be able to run data. I like to be able to see what's happening, how much is being utilized at certain schools. We even drive it down to the classroom in some cases. We found out that we were suffering in testing last year. And the reason we were suffering in testing was when students finished, they were still connected to the network and they were going to YouTube and TikTok and all that stuff to surf and look. And so we had to look at what we got report-wise. And when we go into testing, we block and we throttle all that down. So, I mean, they can get it, but it takes a little while and it doesn't take away from our testing. Are there some things, Bruce, you'd like to add in here?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. We'll go through some of those other pieces as we talk through some of the other sections. There was a question that had come in here along the way. Is from Engine on the Q&A tab. Was there any specific applications that were used for authenticating the student identity during remote exams? Are you able to speak to that one in terms of ensuring the identity of the students when they're remote as opposed to in the classroom?
In North Carolina, the North Carolina State University runs our statewide testing, and we use a secure browser. So our students at home with their Chromebook can click on the application NC Test, and they can only be inside that application, whether they're in our school as a network or whether they're outside of our school at their home. That is something that the state of North Carolina has set up for us. We run all of our students, they authenticate through Google, and that's the way they connect. So really the state controls that for us. And like I said, North Carolina State University does it for us.
Okay.
So, and talking about that, not just testing, but when you're planning for these kind of networks, you've got to think about the learning management systems. You've got to think about video-rich content. We use Lexia, we use Zoom, we use a lot of things that require a lot of connection wirelessly for our students and for our staff. So if a teacher is doing a lesson through Zoom, she cannot have latency and lag. So once we did, and we have been upgrading all of our APs through the schools, we have seen latency just almost disappear. And that to me is a key with technology, because teachers and staff of any kind, if they experience the little circle, or they experience latency, or they experience issues with connection, they're not going to do it. They're going to say, well, I can do quicker this way. So I think by upgrading and keeping our network with the latest and greatest, we keep that out of the way. Now, we're on the cutting edge, but not on the bleeding edge. I do make sure that we're always looking at the evaluations and feedback from other areas. So we're always looking and learning as we go along. I think with us, the biggest piece for us technology-wise is that we communicate, and we communicate to everybody. You cannot leave out your curriculum people. You cannot leave out your CFO. You cannot leave out your superintendent. You can't leave out your parents. You can't even leave out the students. You have got to get that communication, and you have got to talk to them often. You've got to use the same verbiage. You've got to use the same kind of talk. In my department, we have a saying, one band, one sound, right? So we are always saying the same thing and communicating it in the same way. So we try to make sure that that is always part of our conversation. Infrastructure devices, they're important, but the most important part you're going to have is leadership. Because if infrastructure and devices are working and moving along good, that means that your leadership and the way you've designed your network is working as well. And then teachers are talking about how good things are, not how bad things are. Most importantly, progress and change take time, and they take planning. You got to plan, you got to replan, you got to plan again, and sometimes you got to throw the plan out the window and start all over again, right? So I think that for us as a district, our most important part is that we're always communicating with our stakeholders. We're always making sure that our infrastructure and our devices work. Now, do we have issues? Yes, we have them sometimes, but we try to solve them very quickly and try to move forward. We put out these new arrays, and we had some laptops that were 8, 9 years old. The child nutrition director never wanted to replace them, even though I ask every year, we need a replacement plan, we need a replacement plan. Well, when they couldn't connect to the new arrays, he bought new laptops. So sometimes, it's a chain reaction too. So everything now works well with it. So I think that kind of wraps up mine. Do we have any more questions I might need to answer, Bruce?
Thank you, Melanie. Yeah, one thing you mentioned earlier on this slide was related to the curriculum, coordinating with that. I just was interested to hear over the last few years. I mean, I don't know if it's been significant since COVID necessarily, but how has the curriculum changed in the types of systems that you're using within Burke schools, and how has that affected some of the decisions you made on the infrastructure in terms of like going online or remote and some of these things?
So we have seen a dramatic increase in online usage as far as programs that support curriculum. When we first started out 7 years ago, curriculum would say, well, we're going to buy this program, and then it would come in on CDs. Well, none of my student machines or teacher machines had CD-ROMs. So we began to have this conversation about we need to be all of us need to be at the table. So when we bought the last reading program and we sat down, we talked to the curriculum, and curriculum talked with us, and we talked with the vendor, and we discussed the technical aspect of it. Well, it turns out that the one they really wanted, it was not compatible with anything that we had. We couldn't, we use ClassLink as our single sign-on for students. We couldn't connect it to ClassLink. We couldn't connect it to Pear Deck. We couldn't connect it to Google Logins. There were so many issues. They liked that one, but because there was so many issues that were involved in our single sign-on that they like, they decided to go with a different company. And that makes a big difference, because now they're starting to think that way. The first questions they ask of a company is, do you connect with ClassLink? Can we utilize you inside Canvas, which is our 6 through 12 LMS? Can we connect through Google Classroom, which is our K-5 one? Their verbiage has changed tremendously because they're looking at whether or not it'll work with our infrastructure. So now in my department for the past 5.5 years, anything that's technology related, purchase order wise, has to be approved by me, whether it's curriculum or it's infrastructure purchases. So that's important. That happened because the CFO put it in progress and the superintendent supported it. So I think that's part of it too. Our whole way of purchasing and buying has changed tremendously over the past 10 years.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, how these things are more closely meshing because the requirements are very intertwined with each other. Another question that came in from the audience is related to remote teaching. Were they interactively taught and remote students able to ask questions directly of the lecturer during the school sessions?
Yes, so we have, when we were totally remote, which is Plan C for us, we had Zoom. We purchased Zoom so students could ask questions. There were certain times that they would have to be online. That was part of the social emotional learning piece, that they would have to be online with the teachers to check in. And we have a virtual academy, so students, it's all interactive. Cameras are turned on, everything. I think that our remote learning education will never go back to what it was. Our students are doing more remotely, even when they're here face to face now. So I think that a lot of our teachers are, an old term, but flipping the classroom. They're sending videos home for the students to watch at home, and then they're just reviewing in class, or they're going through to see what the student didn't connect with, especially like in math and in some of those areas. So yes, it's very much two-way communication, but you have to have a tool that allows that, whether it's Microsoft Teams or it's Zoom or it's Google Hangout or it's GoToMeeting, whatever it is. There has to be that interaction with that student. Otherwise, that student does not feel connected.
Yeah, absolutely. Some really good points, Melanie. I got some more questions here, but we'll put those a little bit towards the end and roll those up as well. Let's continue forward here. I wanted to talk about a couple other topics related to the expanding needs for wireless and some of the things to support and solve some of the challenges that Melanie was talking through there for Burke County schools. We did a survey here in the U.S. About for our K-12 customers related to the needs for Wi-Fi in education, and following the pandemic, it was evident that Wi-Fi and connectivities in general was being deployed in many other areas. So I thought this was an interesting statistic that came out of the survey, that 46% of schools, so nearly half, were expanding their networks outdoors. So Melanie was talking about some of the things that she did similar to this, putting APs on the outside of buildings to support perhaps a drive-in Wi-Fi, or folks obviously connecting in different areas around the neighborhood with different means. And this is something that we know a lot of our customers went through initially is the portable hotspot approach. It was a quick way of getting online. and simple for most people to be able to connect and attach where they didn't have Wi-Fi in the home. So that was the 18% number in the U.S., 40 to 50% worldwide, 30% there in Burke County would kind of fall into that category, whether it's a teacher or a student. But you are reliant on mobile coverage, obviously, as well, and there are some challenges then with the costs associated with these approaches. So the quick nature of what happened with COVID, required a lot of fast response, and I know that a lot of folks went this direction initially because they needed to get connectivity very quickly. But then we saw some other types of scenarios emerge as well within our customer base, supporting mobile hotspots, perhaps hosted with a bus or otherwise, where you could support remote learning in different places. That can be a collection point for people to come to, and not just connectivity, but delivering food, for example, or health checks and things of that nature, because now the students were remote and you needed to provide different services to them. So this is the type of thing where a hotspot could be put in place, perhaps with wireless backhaul, to support this kind of scenario in a temporary kind of fashion, but also in a mobile fashion to be able to take the network, to be able to take the school services out to the students. And then I alluded to this earlier, but essentially the drive-in type of concept where many schools that we've talked to, both elementary or K-12 and higher ed, have been augmenting their Wi-Fi by taking it outdoors, putting access points onto buildings or light poles where they can find power, perhaps wirelessly backhauling them as well. That's one thing that for consideration is you have to get power and you have to get internet to wherever you're going to be deploying an access point. And with wireless backhaul and perhaps solar panels, you can do that all autonomously. You don't have to connect any wires potentially to support remote Wi-Fi. And these are some of the solutions that we've seen take flight in certain of our customers, where you need to get temporary Wi-Fi out there, perhaps permanently, or it could be even event-driven. Say you have an outdoor event and you need to have greater connections at that location. These kinds of systems can support that. And we saw a lot of this type of activity in the spring of last year related to those kinds of use cases popping up. Here, for example, is just a quick example of a parking lot. One of our customers supported a single access point outdoor, with a broad beam coverage. They were able to cover a nice big parking lot and kind of solve a problem very quickly. So, popping the connection through the building wall and installing an access point was able to solve that use case pretty quickly. So you're extending the school's network just to a new location and supporting those folks who need to have access because they don't have access at home. So following up to that then, and talking a bit broader about what we call the wireless fabric, is there's additional use cases that we've seen develop over time, but also just as part of the integration of Cambium with Zurus. There was an acquisition for Zurus Wireless Solutions back in 2019 by Cambium. And we've come together as a company to really support an end-to-end fabric to solve these kinds of connectivity problems no matter where they are. And they're really divided into three areas. There's what I'll call backhaul or point-to-point links, which can take wireless connectivity to very long distances. In fact, up to 200 kilometers with some of our solutions, whether that's site to site or building to building, location to location, and able to get backhaul speeds of a gigabit or more. So setting up a wireless connection like this can literally take hours, very fast, and surprisingly high bandwidth, perhaps more than you might think in terms of the connectivity, different frequencies and things of that nature. But we see a lot of schools increasingly looking at these kinds of systems to quickly set up links and create high-speed backhaul connections. They could be backups, perhaps, to other connections, to in case there's fibers that are cut or problems that can occur with the system. They can be backups as well. But it's an alternative consideration when you're trying to connect remote locations at high speeds. And as I progress through this graphic, the color kind of changes to different areas that we're emphasizing. So there in the middle there, we talk about distribution. So this is essentially creating and delivering broadband access to homes or buildings. Typically, it's done with point-to-multipoint technology, where you have a tower that's distributing the wireless out to multiple locations from the same tower. And this can be used for that kind of last-mile connectivity, right? So in lieu of fiber or cable or other kinds of broadband technologies, wireless can distribute that. We have some customers in schools looking at being able to do that, to deliver wireless out to homes, in fact, and working with wireless internet service providers to help that type of application. This kind of technology can also be used directly on campus for building-to-building connections. So instead of trenching to connect two buildings that might be, across a street or a certain distance apart, or perhaps you're trying to extend out to some student housing locations in a higher ed community, these kinds of systems can create very high-speed connections, multi-gigabit connections actually, and be very, very quick to set up and simple to set up. And then as we proceed out to the edge of the network, so that's more in tandem with what Melanie was talking about and some of the solutions here related to Wi-Fi, but basically the edge of the network, distributing wireless connections and wired connections within the building or perhaps outdoor locations at the edge of the network. So these are the kind of systems then that can connect all together with these wireless distribution systems we talked about to create an end-to-end fabric all the way to the edge of the network. And there are some unique solutions for high density scenarios. Many schools have auditoriums or libraries or cafeterias or areas of high density. These can create challenges when you have dozens or hundreds of students all trying to connect in one place to the wireless and actually do something coordinated. And that is a very important consideration in education. And there are some solutions we have that are specifically designed for that type of high density access. And this is just some pictures to kind of summarize some of the solutions that I just kind of talked about at a higher level, but some of the specific radio technologies related to the long haul, backhaul, the distribution layer, and then the access layer from the Wi-Fi and the switching infrastructure. Also some products that are related specifically to backhauling video. So video surveillance and other kinds of solutions that you may be deploying across campus. That's a very important aspect of what we are doing today with the video traffic on our networks significantly increasing. And we'll talk about Zoom and some of those things in a little bit, but video surveillance across campus, some specific solutions tied to that. So we mentioned video, and Melanie mentioned, a heavy usage of Zoom, that kicked up over the last year. It's no surprise that video is the new normal, and we've seen a huge uptick in the amount of video traffic on the networks that we service, whether it's Teams, WebEx, Zoom, or Google. Those are the four big ones in this industry right now. And the level of traffic increase, especially from a service like Zoom, has been literally through the roof. That company has seen a huge growth in the amount of traffic that they service. And the fundamental requirement here is does it work, for your users, right? Whether it's in the home or in the school or any of the connections in between, you have to have sufficient quality of that link to support the video. Not only the video, but the voice too. I sometimes see the voice connections kick out before the video does sometimes in calls. So this survey that was done, basically resulted in about 77% of respondents feeling that improving video quality was important, where they may have had areas of their networks or otherwise where they were running into challenges. So this is something that we put a lot of attention onto as a company, just because we see the influx of video traffic on the networks that we service, and ensuring that quality is robust in all cases. That survey I talked about a little bit before specifically asked that question, and no surprise, it was specific to US K-12, but Zoom was the #1 application, and Google Meet was close behind. And then, is that basically creating a challenge within your Wi-Fi network, and performance, slow logins, things like that? We're at the top of the list for most people. So there are plenty of customers we talk to that have sufficient pipes to their schools where that hasn't been a problem, but we have many where they are looking at that infrastructure upgrade to ensure they can take that all the way to the end user in the classroom. And one of the things that is important then is ensuring that priority is given to that traffic. Video is very dependent and susceptible to jitters and dropouts from packet loss or latency on the network. These are important considerations. So one of the things that we've seen is very key to supporting this is creating an application savvy or application intelligent infrastructure. So directly in the access point, you have the ability to prioritize, limit, or block applications directly. So I can identify that Zoom traffic or Blackboard or Google and prioritize that. I can rate limit, as Melanie was talking about, perhaps certain applications, you still allow them, but you rate limit them down, or perhaps you even block them entirely. So you may be doing this, centrally in your firewall. This capability can allow you to do it right at the edge of the network, right when the traffic hits it, and also can block that peer-to-peer traffic as well. But this is one of the things that we find as important as part of the infrastructure to be able to ensure that video quality is delivered end-to-end within your network. And then once that QoS is applied within the edge at the access point, it can be backhauled over the wireless fabric as well if you have that wireless backhaul in place.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we actually did is some testing in our labs. We've been doing quite a bit of analysis on Zoom, and in particular, since it's so popular in our educational customers. And we set up a scenario that basically had a remote set of students and a local set of students all connected over a Zoom session. So in this case, you had 36 total Zoom users, and we put a lot of background traffic on there. And the whole idea was, can I prioritize that traffic to essentially create a good quality of experience? And Zoom has some specific requirements for latency and jitter and packet loss, for example. So there was a before case here where those numbers were actually out of spec with what Zoom requires, and you'll get jittery video, you get dropouts, you get lost calls or dropped calls. We could apply a policy there where we specifically say, let's take the Zoom traffic, we identify it, and we apply a high priority to it, and then brings those parameters down below the requirements. So you get sufficient latency, jitter, and packet loss when you're able to prioritize that traffic as opposed to just creating a best effort. So, again, changing network requirements, can your infrastructure adapt to support that? And this is the type of thing that we've been focusing on to ensure that delivery of this kind of service to the end user, to the student, to the teacher, is being able to be done at a high level of quality of experience, which is obviously critical when you're relying on this for the learning to take place.
Can I say something right here as a district?
Sure.
Excuse me. This is great for us, and it takes a very little amount of time. So we have really enjoyed having this. Excuse me. My engineer can do this in a second. So we really like it.
Yeah, being able to identify that traffic and specifically apply policy. So or just see how much traffic you have on the network, right, as a percentage. We've seen, this little picture on the lower right there, there's about 35% video. I've seen, or maybe 40%. I've seen some networks that it's 70%, right? So it could be a huge impact on the network. All right. So the last section here, and then we'll get into some more questions. So please, again, enter your questions into the Q&A window here. I wanted to talk about some things that Cambium could bring to the table specifically for education to ensure you're able to deliver quality connections to your users. First of all, end-to-end wireless connectivity. We talked a bit about some of the use cases. We're kind of focusing more so on Wi-Fi, indoor here. But that extends out to a wireless fabric that can really go from, connecting a local IoT device all the way out to backhauling wireless at a very long distance. Second, and I'll talk about a little bit this more in a second here, is easy onboarding. It's really important to be able to get users, devices, teachers, students, IoT devices, BYOD devices, guests or contractors onto the network very simple. And we have a solution for that. One of the things that we uniquely do is we directly integrate with Microsoft Azure and Google G Suite. So if you're using Office 365, if you're using Google Apps, you can make it a single sign-on experience for the student or the teacher, where they log into their account and they at the same time enable their Wi-Fi. So it's a one-process authentication into the network, and that simplifies things, but also creates a secure environment. So somebody picks up a Chromebook and they can't just start using it without authenticating, but they also can't access the network. The Wi-Fi is not on until they go through that process. We talked about application intelligence. Very important. That one we've talked a big part of that about video. Video conferencing is fundamental. It's here to stay. Even in the classroom, as Melanie was saying, even though you have your students in the classroom, they'll still be in many cases on the video session at the same time, because there may be a few remote students, right? And everybody wants to be able to see each other and talk. And so the level of video in a lot of our customers, we certainly have seen the influx of that over the last year. High density scenarios, you need to be able to support those auditoriums and high density use cases, whether it's, perhaps a graduation or some kind of outdoor event, or maybe you are supporting Wi-Fi to stands in the football field or otherwise. You do have scenarios where that comes into play, and there are some uniquely crafted solutions to support those kinds of scenarios within the Cambium portfolio. And then the bottom line across everything is cost. I mean, being able to do that at a price point that fits your budget and supports your TCO requirements. So this is something that I think if you look at the solutions and what's available, very, very solid price performance and TCO scenario that underlies all of these technologies. I mentioned a little bit about the access management related to Microsoft and Google integration, and what this is really part of a EasyPass solution that is geared towards getting any kind of user or device on the network as simple and as easy as possible. And so we have a package solution that comes as part of the package at no extra cost for educational customers, where you get this onboarding and connectivity solution. So you can create customized portals and define your access policies to get devices on the network, to do that very simply and quickly and at a low cost. There's no extra charge, on a per user basis for this solution. And again, I'll emphasize the integration with Microsoft and Google. You're probably using one of those two in your environment, and you can integrate the single sign-on with that. And then one more point I'll make is a recent test report we did with the Tali Group related to performance. So we're very interested in what Wi-Fi 6, which is the new technology that's come out, can do. I put a copy of this report in the handout section of the webinar, so if you want to download that, you can get a copy of this report. But it emphasizes some of the interesting things in terms of performance, in terms of TCO, and in terms of density. We did some scenarios in there where we put 100 laptops and tablets onto one AP, and then we saw what happened, and tested some of the metrics for quality of voice and video as an example. These systems can now scale to multi-gigabit speed, so it's amazing how fast Wi-Fi technology has gone over the last 10, 15 years, and this will show you in that context of performance and cost what the current solutions are able to do. All right, and then I wanted to make one plug for an upcoming webinar. So today, March 3rd, this is the webinar you're on right now. We just talked about some of the wireless in education challenges and solutions. And next, well, actually 2 weeks from now, we have a follow-on webinar where we're going to talk about the Gigabit Wireless Campus Network. And so when we talk about some of these other technologies for connecting buildings and remote sites and some of these things, we kind of highlighted them today. But that webinar is going to be driving more of that broader discussion about connecting across a campus. So whether it's connecting between buildings or site to site or backhauling video surveillance or video solutions, there's a lot of technologies out there that are very complementary to the Wi-Fi to backhaul those networks and to create in some cases, licensed or unlicensed connections that can support multi-gigabit speeds. So, wireless today is really at a point where, it is the new fiber. We like to say wireless is the new fiber. You can replace those kind of connections or augment them or use them as backups or temporary connections. And we'll talk through some of those use cases on that webinar on the 17th. So if you haven't seen an invite yet for that, you can go to the Cambium website and find a link to join that. Okay, so went a little bit long there, but I wanted to get to some of the questions here as we wrap up. So let's see here. One question for you, Melanie, I wanted to ask here as well was your process of evaluation. What was your kind of, in a nutshell, the process you went through to evaluate your wireless solutions when it came time to upgrade?
So we looked at reviews online, of course, from other people. We met with 2 or 3 different companies. I looked at, when I met with that company, I looked at their customer service, I looked at their product, and we looked at the reviews. We had a rubric to go by in order to rate them. For me, and any vendor I deal with, customer service is key. And we had that, and we continue to have that with you guys. No matter what I need and when I need it, everybody's there to help. I mentioned the cafeteria machines. Immediately we had support and had your engineers, your high-level engineers, helping us solve the issues. So to me, that is key when I evaluate. And I called other people that had Xeris products. So we had several counties in North Carolina that were utilizing them, and I made personal phone calls. You have to do your due diligence, but to me, customer service weighs higher than anything.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Some good points there. Another question here, and I think you kind of touched on this, but I think it's important to maybe reiterate some of the things. But how were the remote students, so I guess kind of a post-COVID scenario here, how were the remote students' internet connections requirements solved? So you can kind of just summarize, how that 30% you were able to get connected to the network to support things, last year.
So we either utilized hotspots. We have buses that are set up with wireless. We put wireless outside of all of our campuses. Most of our campuses are kind of community type campuses. We created the Wi-Fi hotspots, and we worked with local companies to identify places where students could go and sit and work. So that's how we solved it. How we're going to solve it in the future is we are currently one of the counties that the North Carolina Broadband is exploring on how to get broadband to every single home in our county. So you have to get involved. I'm on that committee. Sometimes you have to be on committees in order for your county to be considered for things.
So that's an ongoing process that may take some time, but okay, good.
I don't think it's ever going to stop. I mean, you're always going to be trying to get broadband out to people.
Right, and then even when you get it faster, right? If it's a slow connection, these days you need to get upwards of 100 meg in some cases to support everything you need, right? So even if you get the access, there'll always be a push to get it faster.
Exactly.
Here's a question from someone in Peru who wants to implement wireless outdoors, but having limitations on getting equipment. So for that question, we can follow up after the webinar. This is Jackson, and I'll put you in contact with someone who's a sales, who runs the sales area for your country there in Peru, and they can follow up in terms of getting access to equipment. So I'm sure there's some specific requirements you have, and we can make sure we take care of those. Let's see, here's another question. If it wasn't more, I think yours probably related to our application control discussion, but isn't it more efficient to block unwanted traffic at the WAN connection router? And I talked a little bit about that where, yeah, you may have policies in terms of blocking apps and applying filters there, which is true. What we found is at the edge of the network, There's also the use case to be able to drop and filter directly at the edge before it hits the router. And you also have peer-to-peer traffic that may not otherwise be addressed by a central point. And that's something that can also be blocked by those kinds of policies. So it's a complementary use case. It doesn't replace a central firewall or policy engine, but it does have applicability when you're talking about doing things right at the edge of the network.
And it gives you the ability to do it quickly and to not necessarily have it as a total part of your WAN. For example, we don't block a lot of video. We don't block YouTube. We don't block TikTok, all that. But we do throttle it down using the application piece when it comes testing time. That way I don't have to rewrite my WAN every time.
Oh, okay. Good point. That's a really good point, right? So you use it kind of dynamically based on testing. Okay.
Yes.
Here's another question for you, Melanie. Were there any changes made to the learning outcomes due to online teaching?
So in the state of North Carolina, we have state testing. That did not change. The questions, none of that changed. But I will say that our day-to-day benchmarks, our day-to-day exit tickets that our teachers were doing, those did change. And they became more authentic as opposed to just kind of regurgitating the facts. I think a lot of our assessment has become really authentic because of this and because of the technology. You can't give a student an assessment that they can Google the answer for. You've got to give them the assessment that makes them think. And our teachers learned that fast and quick. So I think that was one of the big pieces is our assessments inside the classroom did change.
Okay, very good. All right, I think we're about at the end of our time here, so I want to thank everyone for joining here today. Remind you that we do have handouts. This presentation, as well as some of the reports we talked about, are in the handout section that you can download. Dr. Honeycutt, I want to thank you very much for joining today. That was very, very good, insightful, and I think very complimentary to some of the stuff that we wanted to address on this topic here today. So I want to thank you very much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thanks everyone for joining today, and thank you so much, Melanie and Bruce. We'll be sending out a recording of this webinar to all attendees shortly, so be on the lookout for that. But until then, enjoy the rest of your day.